Great, welcome everyone. I'm Chris Tittle with Sustainable Economies Law Center, one of our handful of presenters on this session called Worker Self-Directed Nonprofits, How to Build Liberatory and Democratic Nonprofit Organizations. We are being joined by special guests, Democracy at Work Institute, which we're very excited about, last minute edition. So I'll pass it over to the Dowie folks and we'll each just briefly introduce ourselves before sharing what's coming up.
Okay. I can go first and then I'll hand off. So I'm Melissa Hoover. I'm the executive director of Dowie. You already heard from me this morning, so I won't reintroduce myself other than to say, hi, I'll be talking about the internal workings today. Antu.
Hi, I'm Antu Nguyen. I am Director of Strategic Partnerships at Democracy at Work Institute, Dowie. I'm based here in New York City. And I work on all our New York City related work as well as our Rapid Response Cooperative project. Pass it on to Shiv.
Hey folks, my name is Shivanthi Daniel. I'm the Senior Director of Programs. Glad to be here. I'll be jumping in on Q&A at the end of this session. Thanks for being here.
Cool. And I'm Ricardo Nunez, Director of Economic Democracy at the Sustainable Economies Law Center, and also up for election for Western Regional Representative of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives Board. So I'm just going to use this space as a little elections plug. Yeah, elections are coming up. Participate. Yeah, and that's, and I'll be presenting today. I'll pass it over to Chris. Thanks.
Great, and once again, my name is Chris Tittle. I use he or they pronouns. I'm the Director of Land and Housing Justice at Sustainable Economies Law Center. I'm based in Charleston, South Carolina, formerly of the Bay Area. And hopefully you are here for the session, Worker Self-Directed Nonprofits, Building Liberatory and Democratic Nonprofit Organizations. I just wanted to start by acknowledging y'all, it's September 10th, 2020. Mars is in retrograde. There's a lot of shit happening in the world, or at least it feels like there's a lot happening in my life. You know, I've been just feeling a general sense of anxiety and overwhelm, and I know a lot of folks in my community have been feeling that too. So I just want to welcome each of you. However you are in this moment, thank you for being here. Thank you to our tech people as well for supporting us to be here. There's a lot we could talk about today, but I think the primary question is, as movement organizers and organizations, how are we practicing the transformation that we want to see in the day-to-day operations of our workplaces? And as I was reflecting on why in this moment does it feel particularly important, thinking of cooperation has always been a mode of survival for communities that have lived under conditions of collapse and oppression. And I think right now, a lot more of us are probably feeling those conditions than in a long time. And so how do we survive moments like this in right relationship with each other within our organizations? How do we show up to create collective safety? How do we share power rather than hoard it and lift each other up? I also think of cooperation as a way of prefiguring the world that I want to see. And so that's another way of thinking about the topic today is how are we transforming dominant cultures of exclusion and oppression and shifting material resources of power within our workplaces and in our movement spaces. So Ricardo and I are going to share a little bit about our model at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. We're primarily going to focus on three sort of meta topics: culture, governance, and management. And then we're going to get to hear from folks at the Democracy at Work Institute on their practice of workplace democracy, and we'll try to leave time for some Q&A at the end. So just to root ourselves at the Sustainable Economies Law Center, we have been practicing what we call worker self-direction for probably 7 years in this form. And so we have a lot of lived experience ourselves as an organization that started as an all-volunteer project with no budget to now one that has something like 20 staff members and an annual budget close to $2 million. And over that time, we've worked with thousands of projects practicing democracy in some form or another. We provide legal support to worker cooperatives, housing cooperatives, community-owned energy cooperatives, cooperation in many forms. But we've also been in conversation with, at this point, probably hundreds of other nonprofit organizations about how to practice workplace democracy in the nonprofit context. So we've helped launch something called the Nonprofit Democracy Network, which is a peer learning space where we're learning together how to do this well and how to move through the challenges that it raises. And we've interviewed dozens of other organizations on their practice. So that's where we're coming from, is both of our own lived experience and from learning with other people trying to practice this. Next slide, yes. So we've identified sort of two buckets of tensions that typically come up in nonprofit spaces. One, on the sort of the left of your screen, has to do with the tension between sort of effectiveness and efficiency. And the other bucket has to do with sort of values and the culture that you're reproducing. So a lot of nonprofits struggle with an unequitable distribution of work. On one hand, you have executive directors who are overwhelmed and overworked. And then you have frontline staff who actually have the most knowledge about what's happening on the ground, but with the least power to shape strategy. You also have this sort of dual bottom line of funders often dictating programming or the limits of what programming can happen, rather than the purpose and the communities being served really shaping that. On the other hand, you have typically there's the professionalization of nonprofit workspaces and how notions of expertise and professionalism can reinforce certain racial and class hierarchies and inequalities, and the reproduction of top-down power systems that are often imported from the corporate world and historically speaking, the plantation and the military. That's where the model of hierarchy comes from, that a lot of our organizations, knowingly or not, are replicating. So how do we work with these tensions? Next slide. We've identified a number of sort of core aspects of what we call worker self-direction. And we define worker self-direction as an organization in which all the workers have power to influence the programs in which they work, the conditions of their workplace, their own personal career paths, and the direction of the organization as a whole. And we found that these, however number that is, 7+ aspects seem to be really important in transforming dominant cultural practices. We're not going to talk about every one of these today. We're going to focus on some of the first few, this idea of many centers of power and dynamic roles. And we'll come back to some of the other ones at the very end, but just naming that there's a lot of aspects that need transformation, but are also opportunities for democratizing. You don't have to do the whole thing, everything democratic, but each one of these things, from sort of upskilling how people are trained to how compensation is set, are all important sites of democratization in the workplace. I'm going to talk a little bit more just about the cultural piece and then pass it over to Ricardo, who will talk more about the governance and the formal power systems. And this quote to me kind of really speaks to how I approach this work. Our journeys towards liberation must also be liberating. So while a lot of the things on the previous slide had to do with sort of formal structures and processes, we believe it's actually the culture that is the foundation of democratic practice. And you can think of culture as sort of the invisible structure, things like values and norms and beliefs that shape and condition the work and how people relate to one another. So culture is a really significant and sometimes overlooked aspect of designing democratic workplaces, because as a close friend and mentor, Gopal Dayanini from the movement generation has said, if you don't want the power relations of the dominant culture, you must intentionally design for the power relations that you do want. It doesn't happen on its own, and it takes a lot of work. So yeah, what makes up some of these less formal and less visible dimensions of cooperation? On the kind of personal level, there's a question of beliefs and behaviors. What do people believe about the world? Beliefs come from a variety of sources, how people were raised, past personal experiences, the people and institutions that you're in community with. And we're not talking here about sort of right or wrong belief systems so much as the fact that we have learned that there are certain traits that support successful democratic workplaces. And people have studied this. So two of the primary ones are actually in an interesting tension with one another. The first kind of behavioral practice that's important is resistance to manipulation. So people have to be willing to lead in some sense and resist authority. Maybe that resonates with some of you, maybe not, but it's an interesting component that's come up in studies. On the other hand, there's creativity and receptivity to change. So this is how we create systems and structures. And the tendencies to be ungovernable and to govern actually have to exist simultaneously in a creative tension. And here on the slides are some examples of what that can look like. So beliefs have to do with sort of our personal, they operate on the personal scale. And next, kind of moving to the interpersonal and the systemic scale, we have culture. And one definition that I found useful is culture is the assumptions, norms, and values that contribute to the social and psychological environment. And, it shows up in a couple ways within our organizations. But culture is hard to talk about sometimes because it is invisible, particularly in sort of Western cosmology. So an analogy that a coworker of mine uses is this: you are meat, culture is marinade, but you are also marinade. So we are all, existing in the marinade of the cultures we exist in, while at the same time influencing and shaping that culture. So in this context, the question again is, what is the culture that you're shaping in your workplace? Next, in an in-person workshop or one in which we had a little bit more time, we like to do a spectrogram activity, ask a series of questions and see where people fall on a spectrum of agree to disagree. And it's a little bit hard to do that within this current technological space, but just to name a few of those questions that we sometimes ask, and you can even reflect on them now. But, do you agree or disagree with this statement? The cultural norms at your office are similar to those in other communities that you're a part of. Do the informal power dynamics, like those related to ability, race, gender, and class, substantially impact how people at your organization work together? Agree or disagree? I have a sense of belonging at my organization. Agree or disagree? Just, throw those questions out there. the takeaway, I think, really is that the formal structures and processes that you use in your organization will only be as democratic or transformative as the culture that you all share in that workplace. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Ricardo Nunez.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be re-emphasizing some of those core principles and practices that Chris was bringing up, and how they actually can show up both in the Sustainable Economies Law Center, us as a case study, as a model, but also just how we've seen them show up in other spaces as well. And so the two spaces I'm going to be looking at are two intervention points of where to democratize your nonprofit workspace is in the governance structure and then the management structure. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. This, I'll talk a little bit about the theory behind these things, but I just wanted to start with this because sometimes people read this quote and think it's about not using any component of the dominant models, or trying to create something that's totally new. And what we found is that actually is a hindrance. The interpretation of that quote is that interpretation is a hindrance to our movements, because actually a lot of the models that we'll be talking about, these hierarchical command and control models, those are the ones that we need to get rid of. But the tools that that conventional workplaces can use or do use are actually tools that were stolen from us, and we need to reclaim them. And so when we're talking about nonprofits and designing for liberating organizations, a core part of that is how the structure of the organizations are designed. So who has formal power? What types of power do they have? How are they held accountable, and by who? If we recognize that systems of oppression are reproduced in part by how formal power is distributed in society, why do we think that recreating that same formal power hierarchies within our organizations are going to have different outcomes? And so this is an example of an organizational chart that I know I've participated in previous nonprofit workplaces. You have somebody at the top who is very important, very prestigious. All the foundations, that's the person that they're going to reach out to, who they believe is the leader and doing all the important things. And then as you move down, the ability to make decisions are actually harder, to influence the programming, and the relationships with the funders become more tenuous, but also the ability to bring in the requests and the demands and the desires of the communities that you're working with are to the people on the bottom of this chart, and they can't actually influence the structure of the programs nor of the internal organization. And so we find that in this type of hierarchical command and control structure, we have people who are generally carrying out the programming of the organization with the least amount of decision making. A very small number of people at the top expected to be responsible for an inhuman amount of work. So it's also dehumanizing to the people at the top of these hierarchies. And then there's people in between who, like our fallen comrade David Graeber said, there's a lot of the bullshit jobs. And so we're trying to see what parts of those jobs are actually not bullshit that we can take in and bring in, and what are the ones that we can let go. And when we create dynamic workplaces that free ourselves of these hierarchical command and control structures, that we're able to be more responsive and understand what parts of the work need to get done that are important, that are serving our mission, that are doing the work that we want to be doing, and letting go of those things that people think need to happen, but actually don't. Part of our influence at the Law Center is around how we consult with clients and help clients structure their, whether it's nonprofit workplaces or worker cooperatives, is based on a a woman, Jo Freeman, who was part of the women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s. And she coined the term the tyranny of structurelessness, because part of what she was seeing was in those women liberation spaces in the 60s and 70s, that they were resisting the very idea of leaders, let alone of hierarchy, and discarded any structure of division of labor. And so what they found was that this apparent lack of structure often disguised an informal and unacknowledged and unaccountable leadership that was all the more pernicious because its very existence was denied. And so you would have people who take up a lot of space, able to maneuver and move the organization or those collective spaces in the directions that they wanted to. And the people who felt disempowered and marginalized couldn't even name this. And so what we try to do with folks and with organizations is to figure out a way to set up just enough structure to get moving and to get going, and to create a structure that can evolve with the organization itself. So how can that look? Well, here is a concept that we bring in, polycentricity, or English to English translation, many centers of power. So with this, we've taken a lot of our structures and learnings from sociocracy, one model of governance and management, and another called holacracy. And so we've taken from these models bits and pieces to create our own and to help ground us in some of these core beliefs. In one term that I'll be talking about is circles. In other places, they could be called departments, they could be called committees, but they're essentially semi-autonomous, bounded groups of people trying to do a work, trying to do some type of work, and having autonomy and flexibility on how they're doing that work, but within a larger circle of the organization. Another thing about this model of polycentricity, of circles, and of roles, which I'll get into in a minute, is that individuals don't have to be stuck in one department. They can actually exist in multiple spaces around the organization. Each circle in this model has authority to make decisions about its defined scope of work. And also there are spaces where work that is happening but in different circles can actually cross-pollinate and talk to each other. So how can this look in an actual organization? Well, like Chris mentioned, the Law Center started as an all-volunteer project in 2009. We had no paid staff, we had no budget, and now we have 20 something staff members. We have dozens of volunteers, et cetera. And so these are all the different circles that we created to help move our mission forward and do the programming and operations work that we do. And so importantly, we delegate as much power and autonomy to the people most impacted by those decisions down to those circles. So there are some big, large scale conversations at the general circle, which is sort of the circle, if you can imagine, that is incorporating all of the other circles within it. But the general circle is the staff collective. And it's that space where we'll make our budget. We'll have a participatory budgeting process every year that we come together, get trained by our finance circle and our grant circle, and then make collective decisions about how to allocate those resources for the next year. Other decisions, like around our communications, like our social media strategy or anything, that can happen in the communication circle. The entire staff collective doesn't need to be participating in that. So that's just an example of how it can show up in an organization. And I would be remiss to not talk about decision making, because this is a very important part of how we're actually doing this work. So decision making processes that allow for a plurality of views and approaches. I think one of the things that I've found working at a self-directed nonprofit is that there are a plurality of views and there are tensions, but it creates spaces where we're actually able to acknowledge and appreciate what those tensions are trying to tell us, and for people to bring those opposing views together. And part of our decision-making process is not based off of consensus, which means for us, how we've interpreted that is that everybody has to agree that it's the best decision to be moving forward. But it's actually a consent-based system that allows work to happen even where there is disagreement, because of a clear way to make a principled no. And so the only way to stop somebody from moving forward is if they believe, if another staff member believes that that program decision or anything like that is going to harm the mission or move it back or harm the organization or move it back in its mission. And so that allows people to bring new ideas, to bring new programs, or to modify existing programs without having to convince everybody that it's the best idea. Let's see, is there anything else? Yeah, decisions are adaptable and iterative. So you make a decision at, say, this month's meeting. At the next month's circle meeting, you might revisit that decision and decide we're going to shift it again or go back after you've actually collected some data or real lived experience about that decision. So how we've seen the value of circle structure is that it enables a high level or high degree of autonomy, yet accountable actions, because there's regular check-in spaces for people to discuss these items. It's a hierarchy of decisions, not a hierarchy of people. So people can step more into their fullness, their leadership, their power, and actually claim it because they're filling different roles in different circles and they're not static. What was it? And then it's a very adaptable structure that allows for growth over time. So that's some of what we've seen the value of the circle structure be at the Law Center. There's a question that are some of the decisions made as consensus-based versus consent-based? Yes, so as we've grown as an organization, there are different decisions that we've decided, you know what, a consent-based process to make X decision actually isn't the most appropriate for this. So we've created, what was it, gradient voting system for expenses over $10,000. I think I might have that number wrong, but for large expenditures of money, we've decided, you know what, let's have a gradient voting system where people can rank 1 to 10 so that we can actually understand a bit more about where people are at with this decision, as opposed to just an objection, no objection. But we typically don't do consensus-based. Yeah, I have about 5 minutes to touch on the board and also a little bit on management, and then I'll pass it over to Dowie. So boards. I know in other nonprofits, boards can have a contentious relationship with their nonprofit organizations yes, lots of stuff with boards. So what was it? So at the Law Center, we've really looked into nonprofit law, particularly in California, but it's pretty prevalent around the country, that a lot of the practices of nonprofit boards are not actually legally required. They're just these best practices that have been developed, and then as people move into board positions, they think that they have more power or authority than they might. And so as you as a nonprofit are developing your relationship with your board or evolving it, it's really good to just understand that they don't actually need to be doing maybe a lot of things that they are doing. And so at the Law Center, we really look at the board as overseers of a decentralized, participatory, and inclusive governance and operations. They're not there to step in to program work or to manage staff members. They're there to do their oversight, or something like owls. And so one way that we think about this is that we actually create, instead of a secretary, a treasurer, whatever, that we have a mission owl, a legal compliance owl, financial owl, a governance owl. And these owls are just checking in, and they're making sure that at those different levels of the organization, those things are operating and as they should be. This is actually actual bylaws slide from one of our clients, East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, where they've implemented this OWLS as a board of directors piece of their governance system. And it shows who is on this slide, who can elect each of these different OWLs, since the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is a multi-stakeholder cooperative. When you're talking about your nonprofit, you can create similar types of mechanisms for nominating a board of directors for your nonprofit. Since I just have a couple minutes left, I'll just touch on a little bit of the management piece. Feel free to reach out to the resources that Chris mentioned earlier at the Law Center, our network. We do full day trainings, multi-day trainings on this. So this is just a little appetizer to get your appetite wet. So yes, one aspect of management within this type of decentralized worker self-directed nonprofit is that you have flexible and dynamic roles. So I was talking about circles, and these circles have particular components of the organization's mission or operations. Well, in those circles, you have roles. And so instead of having a staff member with a job description doing one thing forever, you say, what does this circle need to do, this cooperative circle? If what our mission is to create an integrated ecosystem of worker-led organizations for people marginalized by the dominant economy, what's the work that needs to be getting done there? Let's create some roles, education role, outreach role, whatever, and then list the things that each of those people are responsible for, or each of those roles are responsible for, and then people can energize or fill them. And over time, they can actually step out. And so you have dynamism in the organization. And also, for me personally, that's created a lot of feeling of job security. Because even if I'm not the best person for a particular role in the organization, I am maybe the best person for another role, and I can shift in and out of these different positions. So this is just an example here of where Chris actually is filling roles across the organization in our housing program, in our communications work, in our grants team, as a staff representative to our board of directors. And so I'm just gonna skip over one slide there. Another thing that's really important is transparency of information. So creating spaces where all staff are able to access important information, and then for them to be able to understand it. So here's just an example of how we do that. We have a task management system called Asana, and we put all of our information in there, project updates, stuff like that. I see some questions coming in, but I'm gonna save those questions for later because I don't want to eat into Dowie's time too much. I'll just say that I'll just touch on role creation, and then I think Chris might actually have one last thing to say after me, and then we'll pass it on. So a circle, like I said, is a collection of roles. Each role should have narrowly defined purpose, a clear and specific set of regular responsibilities, and if relevant, a domain of action, meaning that only this role can take a specific action, such as updating a website, approving an expense, something like this. So if you're wanting to try this out at your organization, it's great to just start listing like, okay, here's an area of our work. What are some things that we actually just that needs to happen here? And you can kind of start to write out those responsibilities, and then you can start to group those responsibilities into roles and create the purpose. So that's one way of how you can try to implement this at your organization, is just do a little workshop on that. Okay, so I'm just going to skip over some of these roles. I'm sorry. We don't have more time. But Chris, did you want to say one more thing before we pass it off?
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. I'll just kind of to sort of wrap up our piece of it, offer this thought, which is that the technical is the political, and how we choose to operationalize our organization can reflect political decisions about who has power, how that power is exercised, how decisions are made, etc. So things like how budgets are created and how money is raised are important questions. And so as Ricardo mentioned, for us, We have a staff collective that all participates in a budgeting process together a couple times a year. Also, because responsibility is widely shared across the organization, there's really no basis for pay hierarchies. So equitable compensation is a crucial part of this. And that's a complex conversation, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. But in our organization, the only pay differentials are based on need, not based on how the market values and devalues certain people. And just sort of lastly, we found it super important to onboard people really robustly into our organization and the culture, and to also empower people to help shape that culture. And that it's important to visibilize the emotional labor that it takes to be in relationship with people, and to have healthy practices around conflict engagement. And so we do that in a couple different ways. Every year, we commit to multiple staff trainings around anti-oppression. We have every other month, we create a space that's optional, but it's basically just a space of vulnerability where staff sit down together and talk about what's up in our lives and what support we need. It's a place where we talk about mental health, where we talk about physical health in our families, and just connect with one another. And these are the types of ways that you can, I think, visibilize your particular culture and shape it towards how you want it. Not that that's easy, but that it's done together. And I'm sure there's so many unanswered questions, but maybe with that, we will pass it over to Dowie and hopefully have some time to answer questions at the end.
Thanks so much. So I'm just going to step us through, let's see, I'm going to share my screen now and step us through the slides. Let's see though, I want to put this in presentation mode. Okay. So I wanted to share a model that's a little bit different, although really aligned with so much in principle with the Sustainable Economies Law Center's framing. You know, when we develop democratic workplaces, they're all idiosyncratic to a certain degree, right? We can have templates and models and standards and practices, but most of them are responding to a need of a certain set of people at a certain moment in time, and Dowie's is the same. So we think of our model as in progress, and we're a relatively young organization. We're only 7 years old, so things are still solidifying, and I'll sort of take you through how that's working. But the moment in time for us was that we are a startup. We were a startup when we developed our processes. We wanted to hire a highly skilled and diverse staff across many axes, and knowing that, and intentionally wanting a lot of those people to be new to the field of worker co-ops and to worker ownership and co-op development. And then also wanting some people to have a whole lot of experience too. One of the other conditions is we knew we wanted to scale. And so we wanted to design ourselves for growth. And we also expected that, knowing the people in our field and kind of what drives us, we expected that participation would be the most important thing to our staff of the future who were as yet unformed, and that it would also add the most value to our work. So when we thought about kind of all the different ways we could approach this, is it structural, is it cultural, is it about participation, is it about governance, ownership, we thought participation at the point of producing the work would be the most important to people. And so we started, the basis for us is we're worker co-op people. So everything to us looks like a worker co-op. Our values, our structure, our habits and culture are going to reflect that worker co-op understanding and sort of the centrality of worker ownership and control in our work. However, in nonprofits, you know, there is no ownership. So we didn't have worker ownerships. We did have membership, and I'll get to that in a second. And we do have governance, and we have participation in management. So we centered our practices around being, you know, sort of mimicking the worker co-op structures that we knew. But then you sort of, and that's our foundation, then you add our purpose on top of that. Our purpose was really to expand the field of worker ownership, and we anticipated that in that expansion, there would be some need to break co-ops down into their component parts. And so we wanted to be able to do that with ourselves. So though there's no ownership, for instance, there is participation in governance and management. And so we wanted to take apart the worker co-op model, and there's a tension there sort of between how faithful you are to the model and then how expansive you are and how willing you are to take it apart. And we also assumed that we would be providing a place for new practitioners to learn and to shape their own organization. So we wanted to experiment with management and get good at it ourselves as one of the organizations in the field who tries to help other organizations do management. So we wanted to take that apart internally. And then we decided to sort of focus then on the membership dimension of cooperatives and codify our democracy within membership. And it was a way to codify our intentions, but it was also explicitly left really general. So we have this sort of bylaws that show our membership has very few codified rights and really vague kind of initial paperwork. And that was on purpose so that the members could shape it as they came in. So I want to tell our story.
Sorry, Melissa.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think you might be sharing a different screen. What I'm seeing is the slide deck in.
Oh, goodness. Okay. So it's not picking up the presentation, the animation?
Correct.
Is it, do you see it now? Oh my gosh. Okay. Let me just find it. There we go. Okay. Thanks so much, Ricardo.
Oh, there we go. Yep.
You got most of it. Here, look, it just moved. Oh, can you see? Yeah, it was just a cute little, it just showed up and then some other things showed up, but basically you got it. So now this one actually does matter. The motion of it kind of matters because I want to tell the story of DAOI and show how that story shapes our structures. So the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops existed. It's a membership organization. It had always intended to start a 501c3 affiliated nonprofit. And so it did. It started DAOI. And the first thing DAOI did was have a board. 5 of the seats on our board are designated by the Federation. So they're called a designator organization. So structurally, this is how it works. And then we have a staff, and that is a pretty standard org chart showing differently empowered tiers of staff. We'll get into how that gets complicated, but essentially we wanted to set up a relatively conventional management structure from the outside. In part, the people who started DAOI were like not interested in working in a collective. In part, we wanted to see how you could create an accountable hierarchy and see if that could be shared, understanding that other nonprofits and worker co-ops have all sorts of forms. And so we wanted to be deeply familiar with them ourselves. And so that staff has what's called a membership body. They are members within that larger pink box. And as members, the staff elects 2 board members. And so staff members, as members, are eligible to run for those seats and also can elect people to those seats. And then finally, those 7 board members choose 2 more outside board members. So we have a multi-stakeholder organization effectively. Our largest stakeholder is the Federation by numbers. And then we've got the staff as a stakeholder and then the public as a stakeholder. And this gets to something I think is fundamentally wrong with the nonprofit sector. It can be a strength, but I think mostly it's a pathology, which is that there's a misalignment of incentives. Where your money comes from is one stakeholder that's often not as acknowledged as powerful as it is. And then you've got the public, you're meant to serve the public, but then you've got your staff and you've got the people and organizations you work with. And I think that it's really not clear who has control, who has power, and whose interests are being served by nonprofits in a lot of cases, getting to some of the things Ricardo was talking about. So we tried to be really clear. The Federation has control of our board. Our staff has an input into that, and then we invite public input. And for us, that's really clarifying, and it's a point of tension, but it's a productive tension that we wrestle with as part of our existence. And so we do have this multi-stakeholder form. We've aimed for accountable hierarchy, and I can talk a little bit about some of the practices that we have in place there. And we view membership as a learning lab for people who are really new to working in a democratic workplace, but also for people who are more experienced working in democratic workplaces, but may never have worked in this kind of structure. So it was intentionally designed as a space to learn and to build skills and to flesh out ourselves. So these are the bylaws. You can see, I just want people to know that within the nonprofit corporation structure, you can certainly create what's called a membership corporation that has members, and then you can define the powers of those members. Again, they're not owners, but they are members. So just the technicalities, after a year, our staff are eligible for membership in the corporation. They write a letter of interest declaring their, that they want to be members, and then they have to be voted in by the current members. Not all of our staff have chosen to be members, but most have. And so the formal powers of membership are very few. They are really just to elect and run for board seats. And those the 2 seats of member representation on the board. However, the informal powers of our membership, and this goes to the question of culture, are wide-reaching. They shape the organization. They shape how we work. And those are that, membership has advisory power on policy. Membership evaluates the executive director before the board does, and is the primary mechanism of accountability for the executive director. This is the sort of notion of an accountable hierarchy. Membership has all of the information that through open book management, sharing financial reports, sharing grant reports, and there's a sort of a 2-way information flow, multi-way information flow. And this is as members in the membership bodies. And then membership implements most of the policy decisions that are made about the organization through some bodies that I'll point to in the next slide. And I think, that this is an important point that culture, what is it? One of my mentors says, culture eats structure for breakfast. And I sort of agree with that. And I think at the same time, we can't rely only on culture, because culture changes and can be manipulated. And so there is a role for structure and for formal power. And we'll talk a little bit about the way we're moving toward that. So membership mostly exists in the form of a meeting, a general membership meeting quarterly, but it also lives in these 3 committees. So every DAOI member serves on at least 1 committee. There's the personnel committee, which sets personnel policy. It's really the big dog in the room. It, talks about compensation and benefits. It runs the evaluation process, sets up the evaluation form that we all use, is engaged in mediation and grievances, and is responsible for morale and professional development to some extent, although that mostly lives in our management structure. So personnel does a lot of heavy lifting, and in a worker co-op, it makes sense to us in that framework that people would be most interested in the things that affect them. What's happening is we're discovering that the personnel committee may be actually doing too much heavy lifting, like it's a lot of work, and we may need to hire a staff member to handle some of these things. But the idea of setting policy is, I think, really important to our membership. The second member committee is the business committee, which ensures that we all have the information we need to make good decisions and to participate in budgeting and reporting and planning and revenue generation. And to the ecosystem committee builds strategic partnerships. So it maintains sort of an environmental scan, sets the organizational priorities for who we're partnering with and why, and represents us publicly. Some nuances of our structure that I think are really important to understand, again, back to the moment in time and the people. For us, there is like a real power to doing the work of setting policy and implementation. And I think that just comes out of startup culture, that the more involved in the work you are, the more power you will have. And it's informal power, certainly, but it's real. And then similarly, there's a lot of work involved in having power and being in power. And so we're sort of, I think, always riding a tension between the power within the management structure and the power within the membership structure. And that's, you know, there's this sort of a similar tension between the member powers that are codified and those that are cultural. The codified member powers are very few. The cultural member powers are quite large and potentially larger. As an organization, we default to staff leadership over board leadership. We have a relatively low touch board by design, and we set that expectation with board members that they have oversight. I love the OWLS model. So that's sort of more or less how we approach things. And then in terms of Dowie's life cycle, you know, we are coming out of our startup phase where everything was sort of a mad scramble to set things up, and we did some things well and others not well. We're moving into this point of maturity where what we're really thinking about is how to set up the organization for longevity beyond the founding executive director, who's me, beyond the first set of staff. And I think being in the middle of that process is helping us think more clearly about what actually does need to get written down. So I'll close with some of the things that are on the horizon for us as we're moving toward longevity. We are talking about which member decision-making powers we want to codify. Right now, everything is advisory except for the election of the 2 board members. And I wouldn't recommend that, you know, going forward. I don't recommend it now. So we're trying to figure out what we want to say as members. We are designing an information management system. We'll have to put Asana or something like that in place for transparency and information sharing. The personnel committee is leading a discussion about compensation equity. And I've recently had an idea about whether we might actually be able to practice gain sharing, so profit sharing on earned revenue. You obviously can't profit share grants, but on things that you earn, you might be able to approximate something like worker co-op style profit sharing, if that's appropriate. So I'll just say this, I don't think we do this perfectly. I know I certainly don't do the democratic management perfectly. It's really a learning curve for me. And then for our membership, it's, you know, being a member of a nonprofit is a learning curve for all of us. But I think we have done some things really well. And in particular, we have adapted a system that has supported a really entrepreneurial culture and a culture of care within our organization. So I will leave it there, and we have like only a little time for questions and answers. I'm not sure if we want the other Dowie staff to come in and chime in anything that I missed. Maybe we could just make a minute for that if there are things that people feel really strongly about.
Nothing else to add from me.
See, Melissa, you are doing a great job.
Yeah, silence. No, one thing I actually want to note is that there's, I didn't note this earlier, we did put in a leadership team about 6 months ago to create a level of, like a layer that's intended to facilitate better communication and support.
Yeah, I would add that it's really interesting to see, having been at Dowie now for about 4 years, the transition from being a traditional nonprofit to more democratic management, and how that is part of the succession planning for Dowie as a nonprofit organization. I think it's something that is very applicable to other nonprofits that think of themselves as like a more like traditional services kind of board-based hierarchical organization, to what it looks like to implement democratic decision-making strategies and developing the culture, transitioning the culture. Like, we kind of think of this as perhaps a conversion, if you will, like from a traditional business to a worker cooperative. This is like the nonprofit equivalent of that. And that's a bit different from, say, a nonprofit that starts from the very beginning using a cooperative or a collectivist model. So I want this to be sort of like, this is an opportunity to see how democratic management and democratic decision making can look like for organizations, not just small organizations, but big ones that kind of think of themselves in that traditional way. We only have a couple minutes left, but I want to get into a couple of questions, and some of these have relate to scale. So one question is, I'm the director of my department and have been wanting to move to more democratic practices, but know that, at least for now, I can't implement this organization-wide. The organization has 2,000 staff. I do think that there might be space for this conversation at some point in my organization, but only once we prove the concept within my department. Curious about how that might work, since ultimately there are other hierarchies outside the department that will influence the department.
My first thought is whether you can gather data that matters to the rest of the organization, particularly the leadership, to show that you're outperforming the other departments or keeping up at least with the other departments. Like, do you have impact metrics that everybody tracks? Or do you know that they want to raise a certain kind of money? You know, are there things that you can start measuring from the very beginning? Retention, turnover, happiness, satisfaction, that really could be part of a demonstration project. I would say just include data. And I don't know, typically like with organizational change processes, I don't go real hard on the ideology of it. I go hard on the practical implementation of it and then let it speak for itself. But every organization varies. What do you guys do at SELC when you're supporting this?
Chris?
I think that was a great answer. Never worked with an organization of 2,000 workers, so I can't speak to that. But it is, I think, very common for orgs to start at a smaller scale within and see what the outcomes are, as you said, Melissa, and then to use that as the basis for expanding that democracy. So yeah, good answer.
Chev, you worked in a union, like a major, massive organization as an organizer. Do you have tactics for?
Yeah, well, thanks for bouncing that question off to me. I think you're right in documenting, but I think being clear about what the organization cares about, because there might be metrics that you measure that ultimately these other departments that make the decisions don't care about. So, you know, that's important. So first identify the characteristics that the company wants to emulate. And then does this particular model of governance really help enforce that or improve that? I think in addition to participation and retention, it's mobility of people in their workplace, right? Like the ability for workers to feel empowered and feel like they are a critical part of the company or organization. I think whether it be a corporate or a cooperative, appreciate aspects of that, because you're just going to have people that are putting more energy into their work in a very different way. And if there's a way to quantify that and track that, I would start there. But you might have allies across other departments that want to test this out with you. So that might be one way to think about, you know, having it tested out across departments.
Yeah, just wanted to mention that, what was it? We are talking about implementing on smaller scales. And I think some of the questions are like, how would this even work in an organization with 8,000 people? There are examples out there. There's a home care company or organization in the Netherlands that has over 10,000 professionals that are participating in this structured of decentralized nurse-led kind of circle-based type of structure for their organization. So it can reach that scale, and there are examples out there. So I just wanted to mention that for people who are looking to see if this model has actually scaled.
So one more question. I know we're going over a little bit, but just a last one is, what does accountability in a co-op, NGO, or nonprofit model look like?
Sorry, say that one more time.
What does accountability in a co-op, NGO, or nonprofit model look like?
I can just say that at our organization, we have 360 reviews where you review yourself, and then you have a couple of your coworkers review you. And we do that. We typically have done that every 6 months. And then we have learning goals that we'll create in those conversations. And particularly because at our organization, we have decoupled those reviews with compensation. Compensation is a separate conversation around needs-based conversations. Then we can have more substantive, what are your what do you need to build your skills around, your knowledge around, what have relationships to enable you to do the most effective work possible. And because we have dynamic roles in our organization, we can say, what roles are you actually filling right now that you're actually not, you don't want to, so you can step out of those and let somebody else take leadership and learn into that space so that you can focus on the stuff that you're actually good at this point in your professional, personal development.
We have 360 evals also, so you're always evaluated by people that you supervise, and so on a personal level, that's true. And then I think for us, a part of implementing more accountability has been stating our goals as key performance indicators for the organization, but also for individuals, so that you can be evaluated to something that's like known and written and everybody agreed to it. Because there's so much sort of shifting in programs and work. So I think just having, like, that's a fairness thing, like being able for everybody to look at it and see and use the same language. But I guess I also wonder, what do you mean by accountability? Do you mean accountability of supervisors in a hierarchy? Do you mean accountability of people to get their work done? Do you mean your accountability to the community that you serve? You mean accountability to the partners that aren't paying you, but are going to be there long after the funding is gone? I mean, I think that that's like a really rich question. And one of the things that having cooperative structures does is give you tools to take it apart and actually design for each answer to that.
So we're
Yeah,
going
I see how Dowie embeds accountability to the federation in your board structure as one example. In our circle structure, we actually, it's possible to have non-staff be members of different program circles, for example. So that's a way that we embed accountability to movement partners or clients, is by giving them input into our programming.
All right, thank you all. Thank you all so much. We're running a little bit over on time, so we're going to stop with the Q&A right there. We'd like to again thank all the panelists for being on today, providing such valuable information. Everybody, wherever you are, go ahead and give them a round of applause. And you can explain to everybody else why you're clapping low in your room later on. But definitely want to thank and celebrate our panelists today. Thank you for the team from Dowie and the Federation, who've been running the tech in the back in the day. And we'd like to thank everybody for your patience today as we figured out the tech issues. I think we recovered wonderfully, and we're excited to have you all on here today. But remember, today is not the last day of the conference. The conference will start again tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern with another welcoming keynote. And you can go to our website, conference.coop, which Mylene just linked in the chat. You can go to our link tomorrow, same as today. And we would also love for you all to complete our conference evaluation and let us know what you thought about this panel and about the conference generally. So again, you can find both of those links in the chat. Well, I see the SurveyMonkey link is in the chat, and then the same link that you use for today's keynote, you can use for tomorrow. Once again, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for everybody for joining us today, and we will see all of you tomorrow. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. You guys want to do any debrief? No?
Let's stop that recording.
Stop that recording.